What if time does not move like a river, but like a tide? Imagine a quiet street in the middle of the afternoon. Cars pass. Leaves tremble on the sidewalk. A bird crosses the sky and then, for a few impossible seconds, it does not move at all. Its wings remain open. Its body hangs in the air as if the world has forgotten to finish the sentence. A person nearby takes out a phone. The footage is grainy, unstable, ordinary. And yet the image lingers in the mind because it touches something older than technology. It touches the fear that reality is not as solid as it pretends to be. For centuries, human beings have imagined time as a line: birth, memory, history, death. But some scientific models, from cyclical universe theories to ideas like conformal cyclic cosmology, have asked a more unsettling question. What if the universe is not a single story but a repeating one? What if endings become beginnings and traces survive from one turn of the wheel into the next? Most of the time, such ideas remain in equations, far from the small rooms of daily life. But then come the strange experiences: déjà vu, missing objects, historical echoes, people who swear they stepped briefly into another century, films that seem to show figures out of place. Perhaps they are mistakes of memory. Perhaps they are illusions, folklore, or coincidence. But perhaps, in rare moments, the surface of time becomes thin. And when it does, we are left asking a question both ancient and quietly profound. Are we moving forward, or are we remembering a world that has already happened before? It begins with memory, the most fragile archive we possess. A childhood logo, a line from a movie, a name, a spelling, a color on a cereal box. One person remembers it one way, another remembers it differently, and suddenly a small disagreement opens into something much larger. The Mandela Effect became a modern name for this collective unease, a feeling that history has shifted by half an inch while no one was watching. The familiar explanation is simple. Human memory is not a recording device. It is rebuilt each time we recall it, shaped by emotion, suggestion, repetition, and culture. A wrong memory can spread like a tune, passed from one mind to another until it begins to feel shared, almost official. But the time loop interpretation asks us to look at the same phenomenon through a more mysterious lens. What if these memories are not errors, but residue? What if some people are remembering details from a previous version of the cycle, a world nearly identical to ours but not quite the same? It is a tempting thought because the Mandela Effect often feels less like confusion and more like recognition. People do not merely say, "I think it was different." They say, "I know it was different." There is a strange grief in that certainty, as if a tiny piece of the past has been misplaced. The evidence remains incomplete. Psychology gives us strong reasons to be cautious, yet the emotional force of these memories cannot be dismissed entirely. They remind us that history does not live only in books. It lives in minds, and minds are places where time behaves strangely. Déjà vu arrives without warning. You are pouring coffee in a kitchen you know well, or walking into a room you have never seen before, and suddenly the present doubles. The light on the wall, the phrase someone is about to say, the angle of a chair near the window, all of it seems to have happened already. Not vaguely, precisely. Most scientists describe déjà vu as a brief misfire in the machinery of memory. The brain may process a new experience as if it were already stored, creating the sensation of familiarity without a true source. It is common, often harmless, and usually gone within seconds. But that scientific explanation does not fully erase the feeling. Déjà vu can be so vivid that it seems to carry a message from another life, another timeline, or another pass through the same day. It feels less like remembering the past and more like recognizing the present before it arrives. In the idea of a time loop, déjà vu becomes something else entirely. It becomes a temporal anchor, a point where consciousness brushes against an earlier iteration of the same event. The mind, for a second, notices the repetition before the world smooths itself over. Perhaps this is only metaphor, Perhaps the brain, in its complexity, creates mysteries that feel cosmic because we do not yet fully understand ourselves. Still, déjà vu asks a haunting question. If time repeated, how would we know? Would we see the reset itself, or only feel the faint pressure of it in the corners of ordinary life? Some glitches do not begin in the mind. They begin with an object. A set of keys left on the table vanishes, only to appear hours later in the same place, visible to everyone. A ring disappears from a closed room and returns inside a drawer that had already been searched. A book, a coin, a photograph. Ordinary things that seem to step briefly out of the world. This type of experience is often called JOTIT, an acronym for just one of those things. The phrase is modest, almost embarrassed, as if language itself does not want to overstate the mystery. People report these moments in kitchens, offices, cars, bedrooms. The setting is almost always painfully normal. Skeptics point to distraction, forgetfulness, misplaced attention, and the tricks of routine. And often, that is likely enough. Human beings do not observe their surroundings as clearly as they believe. We assume continuity, and sometimes we are wrong. But in a time loop framework, disappearing objects take on a different texture. They become signs of a small mismatch between versions of reality. An item may not be gone in the dramatic sense. It may simply have slipped between two nearly identical arrangements of the same world. The strange power of these stories comes from their intimacy. A lost key does not prove the universe is broken. But when it returns exactly where it should have been, it makes the room feel unfamiliar. It suggests that reality may not always fail loudly. Sometimes it may fail quietly, on a table, in the dust, beside a half-empty cup of coffee. There are stories in which time does not merely repeat. It pauses. A street goes silent. Birds stop singing. A crowd seems suspended for a heartbeat longer than it should be. Someone describes the world as if it were a film caught between frames. The sound dimmed, the air thick, the body aware but unable to understand what has changed. Reports of frozen time are difficult to evaluate because they often depend on personal testimony. They may be linked to stress, perception, neurological events, or the strange elasticity of attention. In moments of fear or astonishment, seconds can feel stretched beyond recognition. The mind can turn a brief interruption into an eternity. Yet the stories become harder to dismiss when more than one person claims to notice the same rupture. A shared pause, even if brief, carries a different kind of weight. It is no longer only an inner experience. It becomes a disturbance in the social world. Within the time loop idea, frozen time may represent a correction point, a moment when the system hesitates before continuing. Like a scratched record finding its groove again, reality holds still just long enough for someone to notice the seam. Of course, that interpretation remains speculative. There is no reliable instrument capturing these pauses, no clock that can testify on our behalf. But perhaps that is what makes the idea so unsettling. If the loop ever corrected itself, would it leave evidence in machines, or only in witnesses who cannot quite prove what they saw? Every loop needs landmarks. For some, those landmarks are not objects or memories, but places. A hallway in an old hotel, a country road at dusk, a garden path where the air feels suddenly different, heavier with another century. Time slips are stories in which people seem to enter the past not through a machine, but through a crack in the ordinary landscape. One of the most famous accounts is the Moberly-Jourdain incident, in which two English women claimed that, while visiting Versailles in 1901, they encountered scenes and figures that seemed to belong to the time of Marie Antoinette. Their account has been debated for more than a century. Some have interpreted it as misperception, imagination, or later embellishment. Others have treated it as one of the most intriguing time-slip stories ever told. What makes such accounts endure is not certainty, but atmosphere. The past does not appear as a complete world. It appears in fragments: a dress, a face, a building where none should be, a silence too deep for the present. In the language of loops, these might be thin spots, places where one cycle overlays another. The landscape becomes a palimpsest, with older time pressing faintly through the surface of now. Whether or not the event happened as described, the story reveals something essential about human consciousness. We do not experience places as empty coordinates. We feel the weight of what has occurred there, and sometimes, standing in an old room or under ancient trees, it can seem as though the past has not ended. It is only waiting behind the wall. History has a strange habit of rhyming with itself. Empires rise, overreach, fracture, and fall. Markets soar, collapse, and begin again. Generations declare themselves new, only to rediscover the fears and ambitions of those who came before. To historians, these patterns may be the result of recurring human behavior. To those who suspect a temporal loop, they feel like echoes from a script being performed again and again. The difficulty lies in separating repetition from meaning. The human brain is a pattern-seeking instrument. We notice parallels, connect distant events, and build narratives because that is how we survive. Without pattern, history becomes dust. With too much pattern, every coincidence becomes a sign. Still, some repetitions are hard not to feel. Political slogans return in new clothing. Technologies once described as impossible become common, then invisible. Old anxieties about machines, identity, memory, and truth reappear with each era's tools. The scenery changes, but the emotional architecture remains. A time loop interpretation suggests that these repetitions are not merely social cycles, but structural ones. Perhaps humanity is replaying a larger sequence with small variations each time. Perhaps we are not trapped in a perfect circle, but moving through a spiral, returning to familiar positions at different heights. That possibility is both unsettling and strangely compassionate. It means our mistakes are not simply failures, but signals. It means history may be asking us to notice what we keep repeating. And if we can notice it, perhaps we are not entirely trapped. Old photographs have a way of making the impossible seem polite. A crowd gathered outside a building. Men in hats, women in long coats, dust on the street. A century-old film reel flickers, and somewhere near the edge of the frame, one figure looks wrong. The clothes seem too modern, the posture too familiar. Sometimes the person appears to hold an object that looks, to contemporary eyes, like a phone. These images circulate because they invite a delicious uncertainty. They are not clean evidence. They are visual riddles. Often, careful examination offers ordinary explanations. A hearing aid, a compact camera, a fashion style that seems modern only because fashion itself repeats. The past is stranger than we remember, and not every anomaly is a message from the future. Yet the fascination remains. The so-called time traveler in old footage represents one of the most enduring forms of temporal mystery. We are haunted by the possibility that someone slipped through the archive, standing in plain sight before the world had language for what it was seeing. In a time loop reading, such figures are not necessarily travelers from our future. They may be survivors of a previous cycle, artifacts of a reset that did not fully erase every trace. A person, an object, a gesture, left behind like a watermark. It is important not to force certainty where none exists. These images rarely defy all conventional explanation, but they reveal our hunger for continuity across time. When we look at them, we are not only searching for anomalies, we are searching for proof that the past is still connected to us in ways we do not understand. The ultimate glitch is not always the largest one. Sometimes it is a small inconsistency that refuses to disappear. A person seen twice in the same place within seconds. A vehicle that seems to vanish between frames. A shadow moving in the wrong direction. A modern video in which space itself appears to fold, repeat, or skip like damaged film. High-profile anomalies spread quickly because they live in the borderland between evidence and interpretation. Digital footage gives us something to study, pause, enlarge, and replay. But it also gives us new ways to be misled. Compression artifacts, reflections, editing lens distortion, and coincidence can create events that appear impossible until the mechanism is understood. And yet, not every strange video is easily settled in the mind. Some remain unresolved not because they prove a rupture in time, but because they expose the limits of what a recording can tell us. A camera does not deliver truth automatically. It delivers a frame, and a frame is always incomplete. Within the time loop hypothesis, these modern spatial glitches are especially compelling. Unlike old legends, they occur in a world full of witnesses and devices. If time were slipping now, perhaps the evidence would look exactly like this: unstable, ambiguous, repeatable only as a clip on a screen. But the deeper question is not whether one video proves everything. It is why we are so ready to believe that reality might contain edits. Perhaps we recognize the sensation because our own lives often feel assembled from fragments: memory, repetition, loss, and the faint suspicion that something important has happened before. Science does not reject strange questions. It disciplines them. The idea of a time loop has a place in theoretical physics, though not usually in the way films imagine it. Concepts such as closed time-like curves describe possible paths through space-time that could, under certain extreme conditions, return to their own starting point. These are not everyday roads. They belong to the far edges of mathematics, gravity, and speculation. In Einstein's universe, time is not separate from space. It bends, stretches, slows, and responds to mass and motion. Atomic clocks and satellites have confirmed that time is not experienced equally everywhere. This is not fantasy. It is part of the working structure of modern physics. But a repeating day, a reset civilization, or memory bleeding from one cycle into another remains far beyond what has been demonstrated. The scientific path requires caution. A beautiful idea is not the same as evidence. Still, scientific humility cuts both ways. Many truths that now seem ordinary were once difficult to imagine. The Earth moves. Light has a speed. Time is relative. Reality has repeatedly proven wider than common sense. The time loop question survives because it sits between established physics and human experience. On one side are equations that allow strange geometries of time. On the other are witnesses, memories, patterns, and stories. The gap between them is enormous, but gaps are where inquiry begins. Perhaps the purpose of these anomalies is not to prove that we live in a loop. Perhaps they ask us to admit that time, even when measured, remains one of the deepest mysteries we inhabit. Every age gives its mysteries a machine. In the 20th century, one of the most persistent legends was the Philadelphia experiment, sometimes linked to the name Project Rainbow. The story claimed that military research had accidentally warped space, rendered a ship invisible, or displaced it in time. The historical evidence for these claims is deeply disputed, and mainstream accounts do not support the more extraordinary versions. Yet the legend endured because it expressed a modern anxiety. After the atomic bomb, radar, code breaking, and classified wartime research, people understood that governments and laboratories were working with forces the public could barely see. The unknown no longer lived only in forests or ruins. It lived in physics departments, naval yards, and sealed documents. Today, similar fears often attach themselves to CERN and particle physics. Some people wonder whether high-energy experiments could fracture reality or open subtle disturbances in time. Scientists have repeatedly emphasized that these experiments are not expected to threaten the structure of the universe. Still, the myth persists because the machine is vast, the language is difficult, and the stakes feel cosmic. The careful interpretation is not that hidden projects have proven time loops. The evidence does not support that. But these stories reveal how human imagination responds when science becomes powerful and remote. We turn uncertainty into narrative. We give invisible forces a name. We imagine an event, somewhere behind closed doors, that explains the feeling that the world has shifted. Perhaps the real cover-up is not a secret operation. Perhaps it is our own discomfort with not knowing where the edge of reality truly lies. If time repeats, what changes? This may be the most human question in the entire mystery. A perfect loop would be invisible. Every thought, every choice, every accident would happen again exactly as before. No one inside it would know. Awareness would require imperfection, a memory that survives, a detail that moves, a moment that arrives too early. That is why the idea of glitches matters so much. They are imagined as flaws in repetition, tiny freedoms breaking through a sealed design, a remembered logo, a vanished object, a street that pauses, a face in old film that should not be there. Each one becomes a possible clue that the loop is not complete. But perhaps the deeper insight is psychological. Human lives often feel cyclical even without cosmic machinery. We return to old habits, old fears, old loves, old arguments. Families repeat patterns across generations. Nations replay conflicts they believed they had outgrown. The loop may be real in a moral and emotional sense, even if not in a literal one. This does not make the mystery smaller. It makes it more intimate. Maybe the reason time loop stories resonate is that we know repetition from the inside. We know what it means to wake one morning and realize we have been living the same answer to different questions. We know the quiet desire to break the pattern. And so, when reality seems to glitch, we lean closer. Not only because we want proof that time is strange, but because we want proof that change is still possible. The most mysterious evidence may be the stories people tell in private. A man remembers a conversation that no one else recalls. A woman dreams of a room and later walks into it. A family notices a detail in a photograph that seems to have changed. Someone driving at night loses 10 minutes and spends the rest of their life unable to explain where those minutes went. These are not laboratory findings. They are human accounts, shaped by memory, emotion, and the limitations of language. Some may have ordinary explanations. Some may be mistaken. Some may grow more vivid with retelling. That is the nature of testimony. But testimony is also how much of human history begins. Before measurements, there are witnesses. Before theories, there are questions. Before certainty, there is someone saying, "Something happened, and I cannot make it fit." A mature approach does not require us to accept every story as literal truth. It asks us to listen without ridicule and examine without surrendering judgment. The unknown deserves curiosity, but curiosity deserves discipline. If the world is caught in a loop, the first signs may not come from a dramatic event in the sky. They may come from ordinary people noticing that the texture of reality has changed for a moment. A silence too long, a memory too sharp, a coincidence too exact. Or perhaps these stories reveal something equally profound. That consciousness itself is always negotiating with time, trying to place fleeting experience into a stable world. Either way, the mystery belongs to all of us, because every life is a record of things remembered, things forgotten, and things we cannot quite explain. So we return to the bird suspended in the air. Maybe it was an optical illusion. Maybe the wind held it in a way the camera could not explain. Maybe the footage was distorted, misunderstood, or incomplete. The responsible answer must leave room for all of that. And yet the image remains, a small living shape against the sky, motionless for a moment, like punctuation in the sentence of the world. It asks us to pause. It asks us to look again. Across these 10 kinds of glitches, memories that feel displaced, familiar moments that arrive twice, objects that vanish and return, time slips, historical repetitions, old films with strange figures, modern videos with uncertain frames. One theme keeps resurfacing. We are not only asking whether time loops exist, we are asking whether reality is more fragile, more layered, and more mysterious than daily life allows us to admit. The answer may not be simple. It may never arrive as proof. It may arrive instead as humility. Time is the medium of everything we know, yet we cannot hold it. We measure it, lose it, fear it, waste it, remember it, and finally become part of it. Perhaps we live in a loop. Perhaps we live in a universe that only sometimes feels like one. Or perhaps the loop is the human condition itself, the endless return to wonder, doubt, memory, and meaning. So if you have ever felt the day repeat, if you have noticed a detail in history that seemed out of place, or if the math of your own experience no longer seems to add up, hold that question carefully, not as proof, not as fear, but as a reminder that even now, beneath the familiar surface of the world, time is still waiting to be understood.